International. And for those of you who don't know Outright, Outright is a global LGBTIQ human rights organization founded in 1990. We aim to contribute to better LGBTIQ lives everywhere through movement building, research, and advocacy. And I am speaking to you today from Washington, D.C., on the day that the United States goes to vote in an incredibly important election for our communities, one in which the rights and lives of LGBTIQ people are on the line like never before. On a day like this, for those of us who are in the US, it can be difficult sometimes to remember that elections, in fact, take place everywhere around the world, and that everywhere, in fact, our communities face challenges, obstacles, and barriers to participation. But the fact is that in 2024, countries around the world that are home to more than half of the world's population have or will go to the polls. In what has been dubbed the year of elections, LGBTIQ people everywhere continue to face barriers to our free and fair participation in the electoral process. And these barriers include violence, hate speech, both online and offline, a range of forms of discrimination, lack of gender recognition, and disparaging rhetoric by political leaders during election campaigns. This leads to the silencing of many of our voices, ultimately undermining our community's ability to fully participate in the electoral process. We're also living in a moment when democracy itself is in crisis. Rising tides of authoritarianism around the world have brought despots into power, autocratic leaders who thrive on the suppression of the most marginalized. For these politicians, our lives as LGBTIQ people are nothing more than political fodder. However, it's important for us to remember in these tough times that LGBTIQ civil society has always had to resist political hostility and exclusion. And we know how to support each other through these moments and how to emerge stronger. Moreover, in recent years, we have actually seen meaningful progress in the electoral space because governments, civil society groups, and other stakeholders around the world have taken practical, concrete steps to tackle this often hostile environment. These include efforts to change ID laws so that trans and other gender diverse people can vote without question or harassment, campaigns to elect more queer people into office, work with electoral management bodies to safeguard the political participation of all, and strategic campaigning and communications approaches to manage the barrage of hate against LGBTIQ persons that all too often accompanies the electoral process. So today, it's important to remember that we can do better. There are paths that have been charted according to which LGBTIQ people can participate equally, safely, and fairly in elections and in all aspects of the political process. The true occasion of this webinar today is not, in fact, just the US election, but rather that yesterday, the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity presented his report at the UN General Assembly Third Committee on electoral participation and protection against violence based on SOGI. We've invited the independent expert and eminent speakers from LGBTIQ civil society to discuss the human rights challenges that LGBTIQ people face in election contexts, and also, most importantly, to shed light on best practices for inclusion and equality. And before we kick it off and get started with our speakers, I just want to make a few housekeeping notes. If you have not already discovered interpretation, the globe icon at the lower right-hand corner of your screen that says interpretation is where you can find both Spanish and Portuguese interpretation. We do have a Spanish-speaking panelist today, and those who prefer to listen to the entire event in English should make sure that you select English for your language of translation. I also want to note that we have both the chat and the Q&A active today. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to hear who's here, where you're from. Feel free to share your experiences with elections. And then if you have a specific question for the panelists at any point, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A. The Q&A is where we will be monitoring for questions so that we can direct them to our panelists after they speak. So on that note, I am to tell you who we have with us today. One of my colleagues will be placing the full bios of our speakers into the chat. But in short, we have with us Graham Reed, the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, Edsi Adhiambo of the Initiative for Equality and Non-Discrimination in Kenya, Alex Castillo from Guatemala, who is representing the Central American Network Transformación, Tomasz Dombosch from the Hatter Society in Hungary, Luis Juan Rodriguez, an independent consultant who's worked on a report for UNDP on elections, and Joyce Teng of Equality Campaign Taiwan. We're thrilled to have all of these speakers with us who have made meaningful contributions to LGBTIQ people's political participation. Each speaker will present for roughly 5 minutes on election-related developments in their country or context, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So we'll start with an expert. Graham, welcome. Graham, you delivered your report yesterday on electoral participation and protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity to the UN General Assembly's Third Committee. Can you share a summary of your overall findings? And specifically, what are some of the key challenges that you identified affecting LGBT people around the world in the electoral process? And can you also give us some hints at the best practices that you identified? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neela, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar on this auspicious day. Clearly, one of the main motivating factors for doing this particular report is the fact that this year is the bumper election year. But there have also been specific inspirations around doing this particular report. And one was Luis Juan Rodriguez, who is on the panel today. The other is Edsi Adhiambo, and the Queering the Ballot Initiative in Kenya. So just being aware of both the UNDP report and attention to this issue, as well as civil society's engagement around elections, have been inspirational aspects to embarking on this report. And I think I'll start with the shortest summary of the report, in a sense, the Twitter version of the report. And that would be the central argument, which is quite straightforward, really. And that is that where there's violence and discrimination, there's less possibility for electoral participation. And where steps have been taken to combat violence and address discrimination, there's more possibility for electoral participation. Now, that does seem in and of itself quite straightforward, but the report attempts to unpack that broad argument and look at it in some detail and come up with some suggestions for possible redress for the inequalities that have been highlighted in the report. So clearly, under the principle of universal and equal suffrage, sexual orientation and gender identity should never be obstacles to full electoral participation. And yet, as the report points out, too often they are. And the clearest example of that is violence and the threat of violence. And this includes bias-motivated political violence that is an inhibiting factor both for voters and also for candidates' willingness to participate in the electoral process. It has a particularly chilling effect on political participation. Hate speech, death threats, some candidates even forced into exile. And this kind of rhetoric is so often amplified during the period of electoral participation. So this makes it very important that electoral management bodies are very careful to ensure that their regulations and administrative procedures are free from discrimination. And the report also highlights the broader legal framework. Clearly, criminalization, for example, of consensual same-sex relations it contributes to an environment in which discrimination and violence thrive, but it can also have very practical consequences because in many jurisdictions, if you have a criminal conviction, you're automatically disenfranchised. Legal gender recognition is an issue that came up very frequently in the many submissions that were made in compiling this particular report and how that inhibits full participation for transgender persons. The importance of comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation that explicitly includes sexual orientation and gender identity can be a very important aspect of offering the kind of protection that's needed in order to ensure full participation, including for people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And of course, national human rights institutions have a particularly important role in ensuring that principles of non-discrimination are upheld. And then there's some very specific issues, such as sometimes there are morality provisions for candidates, such as high moral standing. And in settings in which LGBT candidates are automatically regarded as somehow in the terrain of immorality, that can be an inhibiting factor. As Neela pointed out in the opening remarks, the kind of anti-LGBT rhetoric that is commonplace at any time is so often amplified and intensified during election periods. And social media can really amplify that. And so it's very important that hate speech and hate crimes are closely monitored and very swiftly addressed, particularly during election time. And what is illegal offline should be illegal online, and freedoms should be equally protected in both spheres. In some instances, referendums, for example, with particularly provocative and misleading questions is an area that is focused on in the report. I think it's worth mentioning that in 2020, there were only 230 openly LGBT members in parliament in 50 countries, and significantly 81% of those were gay men. So highlighting the gender disparities and the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination that occur. Mindful of the time, I will just highlight a few recommendations. The importance of documenting bias-motivated crimes, of protecting against hate crimes based on sexual orientation and gender identity, the importance of awareness-raising campaigns, both aimed at the broader public, but also specifically targeting LGBT people and encouraging everybody to vote and participate equally in elections. Supporting capacity building for electoral observer groups, and ensuring that social media companies' policies and anti-discrimination policies that are firmly in place in order to counteract the threats of violence that so often occur in the digital sphere. So I'll leave it there, recognizing that we have a number of experts on the panel who will elaborate on some of the points that I've raised in this broad framing outline.
Thank you so much, Graham, for that extremely comprehensive overview and for not only highlighting the challenges, but also for pointing to steps that can be taken and are being taken in some spaces to safeguard our community's participation. Also, thank you for pointing out the fact that we need to be sure that when we are able to participate, that it benefits us across the spectrum of our community and doesn't necessarily just advance gay men who might not be representative of the needs of the community as a whole. I am thrilled now to turn over to Essie Adhiambo from Kenya. And Essie, welcome. Could you please share with us your experience working on the last election as a leader in the LGBTIQ community in Kenya? This is a country that criminalizes same-sex conduct, and yet you were able to accomplish quite a bit. How did queer people engage with the electoral process, and what lessons did you learn?
Thank you for the invitation, Nila. It was really a pleasure to be part of this panel. I think for me and INEND, engaging in this process was very important as Kenyan citizens. And I say you're a Kenyan citizen before you're queer, right? And when we choose to leave our countries because of the hate, it's a very difficult decision we make to leave home. So one of the things that came up was like, we have always been saying that we need better policies, we need better government, but queer people never intentionally engage, because why bother? And yet if people are elected into these offices, they really don't care. They're the same haters, and they're going to pass legislation that harm us. So that's how Queering the Ballot won was born. Like, could we then try and engage and see if we can actually create a difference? We all want better government. And we've experienced voter apathy, not just as queer people, as Kenyans, because the system is already rigged, right? But as we say, and as it's heard from the report, that you must start, even if it's one person can create a big change, and the movement starts from one person and then it grows if people buy into the idea. So we came together, a group of four LB, for LBQ organizations. Just hold on. I'm having a problem with the translation. Okay. Yeah, so we involved the community in electioneering process. First, we had to register as observers. So we had National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission be registered as an observer organization, an organization that is going to have observers, Western Kenya LBQ, and Elite LBQ, and INEN. So each of us had around 20 LBQ GNC persons who were then registered as observers, who will be on the ground to ensure that general election process was taking place in a free and fair way. That is the beginning of queer people engaging in this electoral process. So some of the lessons we learned was that we need to be involved in other aspects of the electioning process, not just the voting and going away, because these are our countries that we want better governance is. So we need to encourage LGBT persons to participate in democratic processes and be able to elect even one of their own. As the report indicates that we have a smaller percentage of LGBT persons in political positions. Why don't we front our own and elect our own who actually know and understand our issues? And if that then becomes difficult, we elect those who will adhere to favorable policies and adhere to human rights principles. And there's need to encourage early participation on civic, political, and voter education. Why are we engaging in these processes? It is just to vote and really don't care about what happens after, because an election process is not just a one-day event. It is something that starts from when you realize that really my country is really going downhill and we need to do something about it as Kenyan citizens, for example. So through this process, then you check, verify your status as a Kenyan citizen, as someone who does the voting. And for those who have changed their names through deed polls, have that been affected in the IBC register? If that hasn't been affected, then through organizations like National Gay Lesbian Human Rights Commission, then we lodge in a complaint so that the names can be updated. So we also need to encourage narrative change, because during electioneering period and campaign period, we see politicians using LGBT individuals as bait for the electorate. They say, when I come here, I'll make sure that these people do not recruit your children, or whatever language they use. So we need to counter that and encourage people that we can also be leaders and be a part of change of this country. And that was seen just previously when there was protest in the country where people were demanding for lower taxes or no taxes during campaign against the finance bill. We saw queer people come, being part of it, not just because they're queer, because they were Kenyans, are like, all these taxes affect us, and we will not allow for bad countries. A bad country, we will not allow ourselves to live in a bad country, and yet we can be part of change. So it starts from that point where you recognize that this is my country, and I am a citizen of this country, and my government will not oppress me. What can I do with what I have? And how can I come together with the people who are also demanding for better governance, people who are fighting corruption, people who are demanding for lower, if not zero taxation, as witnessed during the previous protests in Kenya. So I think the queer community should, start fronting one of their own. I think that would be a bold statement. We've done it before. I think in the last elections, we had around 3 persons from LGBT community. Previously, we had David Kuria, who vied on independent, as an independent, as a senator. But we need to do more, bring out our own, be part of the process. And then change can start to happen for most of us as citizens who want to stay at home. We just don't want to stay, because we're queer, we need an environment. We need better taxes, we need better housing, safety and security. We need tax-free pads. We need, water. We need electricity that is affordable so that we can live in dignity. Our families can live in dignity. So yeah, so for me, it's the holistic process of engaging in an electioneering process. We are coming into 2027. I think from now, querying the ballot too should start at this moment where we start the voter education. Are you registered as a voter? What do you need? Have you changed your name through a deed poll? How can we support our own to be part of this process so that we can have change? And how do we encourage our own also to be leaders in political positions? Thank you so much for this opportunity. Sorry, I've taken more time.
Thank you so much, Essie. You were speaking passionately, and I didn't want to cut you off because you were also putting out there some really important points and ideas for all of our communities. We are part of our countries. We're part and party of the body politic. We need to own that and claim it, right? And thank you as well for the points about the specific participation of LBQ and gender nonconforming people in the process. I would like to turn now to Tamas. Tamas, welcome. Even within a hostile context in Hungary, where, for example, so-called LGBT propaganda to minors has been banned and progress on legal gender recognition has been reversed in recent years, you helped mobilize civil society to successfully defeat a further anti-LGBT referendum in 2022. Can you tell us a bit about the context and how you were able to bring Hungarians on board to defeat that referendum?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this important event and share with you our experiences in Hungary. First, a few words about the context. So in the past 5 years, we've faced a conscious, coordinated, multifaceted, government-orchestrated campaign against LGBTQI people in Hungary. This campaign follows the same recipe the government had already used against other social groups, such as homeless people, the Roma, and migrants, most importantly. The campaign was built on a coordinated fear-mongering against a vulnerable social group by politicians, so-called gongos, fake NGOs set up and financed by the government, and pro-government media outlets, to which the government responds with restrictive legislation that is supposed to protect Hungarians, children most importantly, from these imminent threats. Restrictive legislation in case of LGBTQI people included a ban on legal gender recognition, further restricting adoption by same-sex couples, and ultimately banning access of minors to any LGBTQI content. To give you a sense of how central the LGBTQI issue has become to electoral politics in Hungary, the central slogan of the governing Fidesz party in the most recent European Parliament elections in June 2024 was "No migration, no gender, no war." These developments had a clearly detrimental impact on the political participation of LGBTQI people. The ban on legal gender recognition meant that trans people had to use ID cards with names and gender markers that do not reflect their gender identity. For many trans people, this would have been so traumatizing that they decided not to participate in the elections at all. Opposition parties were charged with spreading gender ideology and LGBT propaganda, even if they remained completely silent on these issues. The few openly gay candidates were subjected to hate speech in social media comments, online memes, and in some cases print flyers. The campaigns have been so saturated with the LGBTQI topic that at some point in 2022, more than half of the stories published on the cover page of a pro-government news portal were all LGBTQI related, as if this was the biggest problem Hungary had to face. When the so-called child protection law came under criticism by international actors, most notably the European Union, the Hungarian government responded with a referendum held on the same day as the national elections. This was supposed to show the world that the Hungarian population backs the government's position. The referendum contained manipulative questions such as, do you support the unrestricted exposure of underage children to sexually explicit media content that may affect their development? To such biased questions, there were no good answers. That is why LGBTQI and human rights organizations responded with a campaign that called on voters to vote invalid by marking both options on the ballot. The campaign was coordinated by Amnesty International and Hatter Society with the participation of 12 NGOs and 400 activists countrywide. The low-cost campaign under the slogan "Vote Invalid" consisted of flyers, posters, and a number of video and photo stories stories in which LGBTQI people and their friends and colleagues and family members discuss how the hate campaign undermines their safety and why it is important to vote invalid. In spite of the nearly infinite resources the government had in promoting their own position, the NGO campaign was remarkably successful. More than 1.7 million people, over 30% of those voting, cast an invalid ballot, making the whole referendum legally invalid. A bit of a bitter afternote. Days after the campaign was over, the National Election Commission fined the organizations participating in the campaign for abusing their rights when they called for invalid votes. Citizens have the right to vote invalid, but they cannot be encouraged to do so, reasoned the Commission, based on general principles. Some of these fines have later been revoked by the courts, but the highest fines against Amnesty and Hatter unfortunately remain in force. There is a case pending at the European Court of Human Rights now. The moral of the story, well, I don't want to claim that the Hungarian example is easily replicable in other contexts, but I also don't want to suggest that the situation in Hungary is so unique. In fact, we're facing quite similar challenges in different parts of the world. All I can say is this: in our case, smart, realistic goals, voting invalid, thoroughly tested campaign messages, safety, and a broad coalition, 12 NGOs and 400 activists, was able to deliver maybe not a knockout, but at least a significant punch to the staunch opponents of LGBTQI rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamás, for that extremely inspiring story and for exercising your voice to get Hungarians to exercise their voices. We are with you as you continue to fight this battle in the European Court of Human Rights, and hopefully justice will prevail in that case. I'd like to now turn over to Alex. Alex, welcome. Alex, can you tell us about some of the challenges that LGBTIQ people, and particularly trans people, since you represent a trans organization, faced in the most recent elections in Guatemala? And also whether the election results, which were heralded as overall positive for progressive causes, are likely to change anything with regard to LGBTIQ people's political participation. Alex will be speaking in Spanish, so for those of you who are listening in other languages, please find the correct interpretation. I don't see Alex. Alex, are you with us? Okay, it may be that Alex is having challenges. Alex, I can see that you're unmuted. But I cannot hear you. Okay. Alex is having issues with his microphone. I think in that case, we will move on. Okay. We'll give Alex one moment. There's no Zoom webinar without at least one technical issue. Okay, I think we're going to move on to Joyce, and then we will come back to Alex, and hope that the issue is able to be resolved. So apologies for the technical difficulty, everyone. So over to Joyce now from the Taiwan Equality Campaign, Equality Campaign Taiwan, apologies. Joyce,
It's okay.
Taiwan is one place where we've seen successful participation of LGBTIQ people in the political process, not only as voters, but also as candidates. Still, of course, the situation is not always easy. Can you tell us about some of the barriers that you've encountered for LGBTIQ candidates and other forms of participation, and how you are addressing those barriers?
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Neela. And although Taiwan is the first country to legalize same-sex marriage in Asia, but our LGBTI political participation rates still remain very low, under 1%. So for the past few years, we also observed that lots of the LGBTI people, when they participate in the election or they trying to run, they might face the barriers from their opponent and also from their supporter. From their opponent, for example, can see some out lesbian candidate, and she is out for a long time, and since she run the election for city councilor and became the first out lesbian city councilor. She is a very outstanding representative from the community, and during the previous legislators election in late 2023 and the beginning of 2024, she experienced that her opponent openly accused or attacked on her gender appearance. Say, I won't call her Miss because she don't look like one. Openly to say that in front of all the rally getting together, that's a rally for that political party's promotion. That's one very easily can be seen things we can see. And also on her YouTube channel, she do the online campaign to non-stop online like live stream, and you can see lots of the notes under that that video as accusing her and making some threats to her like physical safetyness. That's one. From the supporters, we also observe that very often to see in Taiwan's LGBT political environment. Actually, earlier this year, one of our friendly city councilor just passed away because of the cancer, and her partner, the current legislator, came out and to tell about their story. Actually, when they together working in Taipei City Council, they've been report about their relationship, and the media kind of outlined during that time. And although they have nothing to hidden in their private life, but when the media trying to contact them to get the response from them, one of them got the family to the kind of pressure to ask her not to reveal their relationship, not to openly discuss about their relationship. So the final time they can openly showing everyone or discuss, mention each other on the YouTube channel or on their social media is the time that one is already passed away, which is a very sorrow situation in Taiwan. The current situation is that although they're private open to their families, loved ones, friends, in their daily life, but when they want to participate in the political field, it's still difficult. And how we trying to encourage more people to be out or trying to let them know, tell them their story is possible is that from 2020, we tried to launch the LGBTI political participation training, and we especially doing that for non-election year. And so this year, since the election just ended in the first phase of this year, we launched our training section just the past weekend, and not only from the Taiwan's out LGBTI politicians, we invite them to share their stories. We also invite friendly political staff. For example, they working for legislator, they working for city councilor, they will share how they work in political field. We also want to show more story from the region, so we also invite one out city councilor from Seoul to share her experience from, or their experience from South Korea. And we also found her sharing to see that it's a similar or shared political situation in East Asia, like the political field still very patriarchy and highly dominated by male or gender binary images. So I think we still see lots of things to do, but I'm glad that we start the training section and start the communication with not only in Taiwan, but also in the region.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Thank you. Really exciting to hear about the regional alliance building. Obviously, we know that any country only has a fairly small number of LGBTIQ out candidates. So those alliances are crucial across borders, sharing of experience. Also, your comments make clear that political attacks on women are an LGBTIQ issue. Political attacks on people's families and private lives are an LGBTIQ issue. And these are all things that perhaps we can build broader alliances around as well. I want to go back to Alex now. Alex, are you able to get access to audio now?
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Espero me escuchen bien.
Sí. Okay, Alex, over to you. Go ahead.
Bueno, yo creo que en Guatemala el año 2023 fue una revolución completa democrática, donde hubieron 106 días de resiliencia promovida desde los movimientos indígenas, donde empezamos a pelear por nuestra democracia. Yo creo que ya me han antecedido bastante bien con todas las realidades que nos toca afrontar en las diferentes regiones. Yo creo que el mundo está muy marcado con los temas, como bien lo decía el experto independiente, que muchas veces somos utilizados las poblaciones LGTBIQ+, como un escudo antivoto, ¿verdad? Entonces, esos discursos han venido durante muchos años y en todas las regiones del mundo, y Guatemala no fue la excepción. De hecho, Guatemala fue declarada la protección, la ciudad latinoamericana para la protección a la vida y la familia por el gobierno anterior. Y eso fue un gran retroceso en materia de derechos humanos, no solo para las poblaciones LGTBIQ+, sino también para nosotros, los cuerpos que tenemos la capacidad de gestar. El tema del aborto, el tema en contra de la población LGTBI, son discursos que siempre van a utilizar políticos que están en contra dentro de nuestros derechos humanos. Obviamente, el año pasado en Guatemala vivimos elecciones muy conflictivas, hubieron más de 30 partidos políticos, entonces en un país de 17 millones de habitantes era como muchos partidos políticos y obviamente el voto LGTBIQ+ contaba y creo que al final de la historia nuestro derecho al voto, especialmente para las personas trans y personas no binarias, es un derecho al cual no debemos de renunciar. En Guatemala es posible cambiarse el nombre para Manuel Detonante Género y aunque hay políticas, hay respeto, hubo empatía por parte de los movimientos a incluirnos dentro del tema de votaciones, solo tuvimos el derecho a elegir, más no a ser electos, ya que obviamente una persona trans o una persona no binaria iba a ser atacada públicamente y sabían que eso iba a ser muy devastador. Se estuvieron capacitando para las mesas electorales, pero también los movimientos sociales invitamos a nuestras comunidades a no renunciar a su derecho. Sabemos que cuando entra una persona trans a un espacio donde su documento de identificación no está acorde a nuestra expresión de género, muchas veces desde la risa, la burla, el cuestionamiento de nuestros documentos, hace que nos sintamos cohibidos para poder ejercer este derecho. Hubimos varios compañeros que acompañamos en este proceso para que fuera un poco más amigable el tema del derecho al voto. Creo que es no solo exigir el derecho al Estado, sino que a nuestras comunidades a no renunciar, a que nos acompañemos y que nos acuerpemos en ese derecho que tenemos a elegir a nuestras nuevas autoridades. Fue muy emocionante realmente pos elecciones ver que no querían respetar esas grandes estructuras de poder que hemos platicado, ceder el espacio o ceder el poder a un nuevo gobierno que, si bien es cierto no era inclusivo LGTBIQ+, esperábamos que no nos violentara más. Fueron 106 días de resiliencia que se tuvo para poder que las autoridades tomaran el lugar que hoy tienen y que el derecho o el voto del pueblo fuera respetado. Creo que es un momento histórico para Guatemala estas elecciones, y por supuesto el movimiento LGTBI fuimos parte de este proceso democrático. Fuimos parte de esa resiliencia, estuvimos en las marchas, salimos, tomamos las calles, y hoy por hoy seguimos esperando a que el actual gobierno respete nuestra agenda LGTBIQ+ y tenga bien reunirse con nosotros, ya que es de los pocos movimientos que aún no se reúne el gobierno después de un año que va a cumplir ya de estar en tema del poder. Pero lo más importante es no renunciar a ninguno de nuestros derechos, ejercerlo, hacerlo valer, y sobre todo acuerparnos si tenemos cierta temor cuando vamos a hacerlo. Y ese es mucho trabajo de las comunidades, liderazgos, y eso nos lo demostraron nuestros pueblos originarios en Guatemala en el año 2023. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. Gracias, Alex. And thank you for pointing out the efforts that the community has undertaken itself to keep its own people safe, to make sure that people can go to the polls and that nobody is left on their own if they're afraid of facing discrimination at the polls. That is an incredibly important and powerful way to ensure political participation. And best of luck with engaging with the new government. Finally, over to our last speaker, Luis. Luis, you recently authored a report from the UNDP on inclusive democracies, sharing some of the best practices on LGBTIQ persons in electoral processes. Can you share some of these best practices with our audience, and tell us also what different stakeholders should be doing to bring about a process that is truly inclusive?
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much to Outright International and to the UN independent expert for the invitation and the opportunity to take part in this enriching conversation. In 2023, the United Nations Development Programme published a global guide on the participation of LGBTI persons in political and electoral processes, which I had the honor to author. The purpose of the publication was to identify entry points for the greater participation of LGBTI persons throughout the electoral cycle and the wider political process, and also to gather good practice from a wide range of stakeholders with a particular focus on the Global South. I would be grateful with organizers if you could share the link to the publication. Oh yes, I just saw that Juniper did. Thank you. And now I would like to share with you some of the main findings of this UNDP report. First, political parties in various regions and from diverse ideological backgrounds have supported the participation of LGBTI leaders in decision-making and elective office, including by recognizing the rights of the community in their foundational documents and policies, adopting voluntary candidate quotas and nominating LGBTI candidates, providing training for LGBTI party members and supporting the work of internal LGBTI groups and networks or associated entities. In South Africa, for instance, several political parties have adopted measures to promote the participation of LGBTI persons, including the African National Congress, the Democratic Alliance, and the Economic Freedom Fighters. These parties have created internal LGBTI structures and networks to promote the participation of LGBTI party members, appointed LGBTI activists as candidates and in internal decision-making structures, and conducted advocacy efforts more broadly in the African region. Second, around the world, electoral management bodies have adopted policies to guarantee the right to vote of trans and non-binary persons without discrimination, including respectful identification procedures, training for polling staff, and targeted voter education campaigns. Some examples include the electoral administrations of Bangladesh, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, India, Pakistan, and Peru, among many others. Third, LGBTI intergroups and caucuses have been created within parliaments of several countries, including Brazil, North Macedonia,